This is Current Reflections, a production of Tribal College, Journal of American Indian Higher Education.
For this installment of Current Reflections, we are joined by legal scholar and Institute of American Indian Arts professor Stephen Wall. I'm Bradley Shreve. A citizen of the White Earth Nation, Stephen Wall was born in New Mexico and raised on the Mescalero Apache Reservation. He earned his Juris Doctorate degree from the University of New Mexico and went on to serve as a community organizer, health administrator, prosecutor, and as the chief judge of the Mescalero Apache tribe. In 2006, Wall was appointed as the founding chair of the Indigenous Liberal Studies Department at the Institute of American Indian Arts. He is now an emeritus professor at IAIA, as well as the author of the book American Indian Tribal Governance, A Critical Perspective. Professor Wall has authored numerous other articles and essays, including the influential treatise The Good Citizen, and more recently, Sacred Sites, Sacred Rights, Preparing the Next Generation of Protectors, both published in Tribal College Journal. Thanks for joining us. We're honored to have you here, Steve, and to discuss our current theme, artificial intelligence.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'm honored that you chose me to talk about this topic that I have thought a lot about, but have no technical knowledge about.
Yeah, it's becoming increasingly invasive in our lives, and I think the reason we selected this theme for this issue is to kind of bring some of the minds in the tribal college movement together to discuss and kind of work through this, because it's going to become even more pervasive in the near future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in your article, The Good Citizen, you stated that a tribe's historical experience informs how its core cultural values are defined. And due to differing experiences, different tribes have different values. What effect does advancing technology have on cultural values?
Well, boy, I think primarily what we see as we begin to see the development across the world, across the planet, of a monoculture, which doesn't leave room for cultures that may be or really tied to the land or to the water. And what I mean by this is when we look at what's been happening in both the United States and around the world since World War II, we've seen a movement to flatten out differences, particularly between societies. And I don't think that there's anybody sitting somewhere saying we need to do this. But what it is it's the unintended impact of certain practices and policies. For example, back in the 60s, there was this thing called the Green Revolution, which was uh, using chemically based fertilizer to enhance productivity, as well as genetically modified grains. Well, what ends up happening from that is now we have a monocultural agriculture that's basically dominated by industry as opposed to small community farmers. When you go through the Midwest, I took a trade trip a few years ago out to Chicago and from Albuquerque, and you just go through Missouri and Illinois, and it's just row after row of corn and soybeans, and that's all there is. That's a monoculture. There's very little diversity, very little variety. What we see from modern mass communications, particularly digital communications, we start seeing a worldwide pop culture movement that everybody in the planet participates in. And now with AI, I think that some of the built-in um, platforms and sources of knowledge that AI is trained in will flatten out differences between cultures even more, because people turn to AI, especially the generative AI, and they will start seeing the same answers to the same questions, regardless of where they're at, and regardless of how appropriate those questions are to a particular community and the values of that community. But yeah, I see that as a real flattening of any differences um, culturally between people, and that's a threat to the culture.
Yeah. Wow. That's I didn't even think of that about the same answers to the same questions. So yeah, that's really interesting. So often you hear of historians and others discuss assimilation as something in the past. They talk
Mhm.
about the assimilation era of allotment, boarding schools, and termination, and that we are now in an era of self-determination and cultural revitalization. But obviously, assimilation is a force that continues to affect Native people. How does artificial intelligence fit into this?
Well, it's just kind of related to the previous, or this answer is kind of related to the previous answer, and that is that, we look at things, there's these unintended consequences. And I remember when the Indian Self-Determination Act was passed, everybody said, all right, yay. And that's true. I mean, the BIA had a lock hold on native tribes, in up until the up and into the early 70s. And with the Indian Self-Determination Act, things changed and tribes began to be able to establish their own priorities and that kind of stuff. So everybody's happy about that, but nobody looked at it very critically. And the reality is that the Indian Self-Determination Act, very much like the Indian Reorganization Act 40 years prior, were two of the most assimilative things that's happened in Indian country. We've had the forced assimilation of the boarding schools, of allotment, and then we had this kind of oh, you guys need to set up your governments, and here's a cool way to set up your governments, and and by the way, it has to be kind of set up this way because we're not going to allow your traditional governments to participate. Um, and that was the IRA, and so tribes began to assimilate into Western style governance. And then with the Indian Self-Determination Act, we assimilated into Western style of administration, of government administration, such as providing services and uh, doing those things that governments do in terms of accountability for money, um, keeping controls over the property of the tribe that the tribe uses to deliver services and those kinds of things, counting programs, all of that. We became assimilated into that, and people didn't even think about it. They didn't even question it. Um, the same thing with AI is that assimilation is something that never ends. Right now, we still see it. We see it in the VAWA laws, where we can only get jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit domestic violence on the reservation if our court systems mirror the state systems. And that's an assimilative process. Assimilate us more deeper into Western jurisprudence in that case. With AI, it's kind of the same thing. In order to participate in AI, you have to have certain programs, certain platforms. You have to have people who understand input and the use of particular operating systems in order to make AI work for you. That brings us further and further into an assimilation type consequence, because how we address problems in the community needs to be something that the community has control over, not a code writer in Silicon Valley or Phoenix or wherever.
Yeah. In the epilogue of your book, American Indian Tribal Governance, you discuss how tribal communities face tremendous challenges moving forward, and that globally, major changes, largely due to the rapid growth of technology, are creating instability and turmoil. You mentioned digital mass media and climate change, but what role do you see AI playing?
I see AI as being very disruptive. I mean, right now you got ethicists debating how far they should take, this this form of AI, which is there's many forms of AI, and I'll get to that in a couple of minutes. But how far do we take that towards its ability to become reasoning and making decisions and weighing evidence, and what's the consequences of AI making decisions as opposed to the human aspect of it? I think that when we look at AI, we need to realize that we've been dealing with it for a long time. Anybody who has a smartphone or just a computer and they're writing on their computer and has autocorrect, that's a form of artificial intelligence. Trying to send a text, it keeps autocorrecting and sending the word that you don't want to send. That's a pretty common experience. That's the function of AI, and that's also should be a warning, because I can type in something that I want that may be culturally specific into my phone to send a text, and autocorrect will turn it into something that the computer wants it to be, not what I want it to be. And so we have this, again, goes back to the flattening of cultures, and it goes back to assimilation. And it's really, how much of a world do we want that is not based in human diversity? And that's really a real challenge in my mind, because we're looking at a future that, we get to choose life or we get to choose death, as we go forward. And that's another discussion of its own. But the reality is that AI limits the kinds of decisions that can be made, because they have to be decisions that fit within the parameters of what AI has been programmed to respond to. And it's just we think of AI's challenge as being these self-aware robots that run around doing things, or um, robot armies that are going to fight wars. And we think about AI as that. We don't necessarily think about it on our own personal terms. And I'm trying, I've thought a number of times, well, how do we use AI in a tribal community? And only thing I can think of right off is that at some point, grant funding and stuff like that will be handled through AI created systems, as opposed to what we do now. But within the community, I really wonder about its application. But I know that we live as a microcosm within American society, and if all the other part of the society is participating in AI, there's going to be tremendous amount of pressure, regardless of what form it is, for tribal people to participate on an equal basis with everybody else in the United States. And that's, to me, very scary. And because there's another ethical question, not just the question of how far do we take this in terms of its self-awareness, of does AI have self-awareness, and can it act upon that self-awareness? But there's another issue I think is more fundamental, and that is, who are we as human beings? And what does it mean to be human? And I think that's a major challenge that the ethicists may be avoiding. I can remember. I'll come back to that later.
Okay. Yeah. So at the end of your essay, The Good Citizen, you ask, how do we care for each other? How do we care for the earth? How do we ensure the viability of our languages? How do we develop our communities for future generations? Do you see ways that AI can be employed for the betterment of Native communities and society more broadly?
I'm sure that there are people who work in areas of finance or law. I mean, a lot of times lawyers now use search engines to find court cases and help create their arguments. I'm sure that there's individual applications within certain fields within the community, but as a whole, I don't see AI as being something that um, is going to really change Native communities for the better. Um, what was just going through my mind when I was thinking was that answering that last question was, well, what about farming? I live right here next to Jemez Pueblo. My wife's from Jemez Pueblo, and I've farmed a field there for a few years before my daughter took over. And how's AI going to help me plant? How's it going to help me weed? How's it going to help me irrigate? Um, Basically, what I see is a whole lot of AI taking power away from human beings, and particularly their power to be human. I think there's a lot of people who want to relinquish that power, who would rather have somebody else make the decisions, people who just sit back and want to be entertained in this world. But for people who really want to make the world work and do the things that human beings do in terms of compassion and empathy and love and hate and anger and escape and all those human things that we have that makes up our community, I'm not too sure that AI has a whole lot to offer. And I will say, and this is what I was going to say earlier, and I forgot the guy's name, I can't remember his name, but I was in South Africa in 2007, and we had a meeting in Cape Town with a guy who is the Chief Justice of the South African Supreme Court. And he was talking about, he had never met Native Americans. Well, he had, but he had never spoken to a group of Native Americans. And we were there, listened to his talk, and he was talking about the Human Genome Project. Now, he was one of the jurisprudential ethicists that the UN or somebody had assigned to work on the Human Genome Project, which was a mapping of human DNA. And he said we'd just finished the project, and we're sitting around the room. We'd completed it. We're happy that we had completed the project, and all of a sudden the door started knocking. Somebody's beating on the door, and they wouldn't stop. So one of the people at that table got up to answer the door, and in comes this native guy. I'd have no idea who it was. Native guy from North America, and he was trying to stop the Human Genome Project, and they told him that it was done. It's all done. It's all finished. And he asked these people sitting in that room, who gave you permission? Who gave you permission to dig around human DNA? And I was really struck by that. And he was too, because he realized that this native person was coming from a more spiritual perspective in terms of who authorizes these kinds of deep intrusions into the very makeup of what it is to be at least physically human. And I see the same thing in in the notion of law, and that is that prior to Aristotle, we didn't have a whole lot of people making laws. If you look at, and then this is in my book, The American Indian Tribe and Tribal Governance, people who delivered the laws, whether it's Moses of the Bible or Hammurabi from ancient archaeological texts in Samaria, or even Moctezuma in Tenochtitlan. These guys didn't make the law. They delivered the law from a higher source. They were mediators. It wasn't until Aristotle came along and says, oh, we can make laws. We need to structure our society like, okay, we have the legislative, the executive, the judicial branch, and it's all about making laws. But until then, and in a lot of other communities since then, making laws is not something that people are entitled to do. Messing with using artificial intelligence to make decisions that need to be based in humanity and one's human response to the successes or failures of other people, or decisions of government or policies that support or do not support other people. That needs to be something that's done by human beings and not by AI. And who gave who the permission to create something that has that much power over human beings? Who gave them the permission?
Yeah. Well, there's the old axiom, doesn't really matter what the risk is. If it's possible to be developed, somebody somewhere will do it, especially when money's involved.
Well, that's definitely a culture-bound axiom, one that's built into the development of science in the 1600s and the development of the nation state in Europe, but it's not an indigenous concept.
Yeah. Well, and capitalism too. So,
Oh yeah.
so much of this is based on, the billions of dollars to be had in making the next advancement.
Sure.
Stephen Wall is the founding chair of the Indigenous Liberal Studies Department at the Institute of American Indian Arts. He's also the author of the treatise The Good Citizen, which can be accessed at tribalcollegejournal.org. We'll be back in a moment with our conversation on artificial intelligence.
Yate, this is Marvin Tom, the advertising coordinator for the Tribal College Journal. Since 1989, TCJ has earned a loyal following of readers who are passionate about American Indian education. Our dynamic media outlet reaches a diverse, wide-ranging market, including students, educators, and lawmakers. And here's the best part, TCJ offers a variety of reasonable price advertising options that can be placed in our magazine, on our website, or right here in our Current Reflection podcast. For more information, contact me at 970-764-4238 or at marvin@tribalcollegejournal.org. Yeah.
You're listening to Current Reflections, and I'm speaking with Stephen Wall about artificial intelligence. So you also point out in your article, The Good Citizen, that there are shared indigenous values, one of which is recognizing the rights of all beings, animate and inanimate, something which Dan Wildcat also delves into in this new issue of TCJ on AI. But in your view, does this apply to what technologists are now calling digital minds? Or maybe a better way to frame this, would this value apply to an AI bot that has the ability to reason?
I don't think so. Because coincidental to that idea of recognizing the rights of both the animate and inanimate is the idea of reciprocity. And reciprocity is something that's based not just in a transactional relationship, which is basically what contemporary capitalism sees reciprocity as transactional, but it's actually a spiritual relationship. And so if you're going to recognize something as having a right to exist and having a place in the world, then you also know that that thing is going to somehow support your life based on who you are. And until AI reaches this point of having emotions, and I think of Data in Star Trek: The Next Generation. He struggled as a bot to have emotion. He wanted that thing that would make him human, which he never got. Close, but never got. And reciprocity is something that happens on a spiritual level between human beings and the rest of the world. And we say our prayers, we plant our seeds, we go hunting, we participate in ceremonies, we care for relatives. We do all of these kinds of things as a reciprocal act as we walk through this earth. But would AI bot be able to appropriately respond to my recognition of its right to exist? Because if I shoot a deer, we have a relationship. And that deer is responding to me, and I'm responding to the deer on a spiritual level as well as a physical level. Is the bot capable of doing that? And if it's not capable of doing it, then it really doesn't have that right.
Yeah, this issue of kind of the rights of AI, so to speak, is becoming increasingly pronounced in the discussion. I was recently listening to a podcast on NPR, and MIT sociology professor Sherry Turkle, who studies technology's effects on human psychology, has written about what she calls artificial intimacy, whereby people get on their computers, log into their chat bot platform, and have conversations with the bot, which even has oftentimes its own attractive avatar. Turkle notes that an increasing number of people are having what can only be described as intimate relationships with these AI bots/avatars, where they confide in them, discuss their fears and concerns, and where the bot in turn will give positive reinforcement, reaffirm them, even give them a romantic spark. Turkle notes that some psychologists support this. There are users who report increased feelings of happiness, at least initially, marshaling core indigenous values. How do we make sense of this?
Now, first of all, you can't. But we got to look at it as a phenomenon that is based in a couple of things. I think, first of all, and I think most appropriately, we live in a very alienated world. I think that I think it was Karl Marx who said that alienation is part of the capitalist production. That people are alienated from each other and alienated from the things that they produce because of the process of production. And I'm not going to comment one way or the other on that, except that we do know alienation exists. We also know that loneliness exists. And when people are both alienated and lonely and have the resulting challenges to mental health that come from that, it doesn't surprise me that there's some level of reliance on something other than humans to help a person regulate themselves. And that's I guess one of those things where I mentioned earlier that there's people who would be willing to turn over their humanity and their power as human beings over to a machine so they wouldn't have to deal with some of the messy issues. And I think this is one of those examples. It's hard being a human. You know, we have these periods of incredible joy, and we have these periods of incredible sadness. We lose our parents, we lose our siblings, we lose our children. You know, we go through a world that we get to see things that are sacred to us being destroyed by quote progress. Our emotions are just being constantly torn up or built up. And it's hard being a human. And if you don't have a way of relating to other human beings because of the power of our individual emotions, then you've got to turn somewhere. And people, because of their alienation and because of their loneliness, can and will turn to these machines. And I think that it's a sad state of affairs, and it's also a sad statement that people can become emotionally dependent upon one of these machines, as opposed to being open to other human beings and what other human beings can offer. And those people must be terribly traumatized by their interaction with their fellow humans, in, or terribly lazy and fearful of dealing with life. And I know that's a real indictment on people who are suffering, but I can see why some psychologists would say, yeah, this is a great thing because there are people out there who need something. But it's not the real thing. It's not human touch. It's not human insight. It's not human support. And people may feel that they're getting something out of it, but that spiritual element doesn't exist. Remember, these things are, and this is the real question: are bits of electricity spirituality? And these little electrical impulses, does that constitute spirituality? And in some ways, we look at a bolt of lightning and we may see a spiritual aspect to that as when we see that happen. Do we see the same thing when this impulse of electricity creates a 0 or a 1 in computer code? I think the source of the electricity is really the question. The source of the electrical impulse, in my mind, is spiritual if it's coming from the natural world. It's not spiritual if it's coming through our human creation, because that puts us in a position of being able to create spirituality, and human beings should not have that authority.
Yeah, that's really profound. There's actually a new book that kind of delves deeply into that. Homo Deus, I believe it's called. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's he talks about, the author discusses how, with these advances in AI, we're kind of reaching, or at least trying to reach, this kind of godlike status.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And I guess that's one of the things that's one of the difference between indigenous spirituality and and I wouldn't say Western, because it's not just something that's coming out of the continent, but it's also something that's someplace in America, and not in the psychology of human beings, that they want to be God.
Yeah.
And megalomaniacs and extreme narcissists all want to control the world. They want to rule the world. They want to be the richest person in the world, like Elon Musk, or they have high ideas of themselves, and they feel like they have the authority to run the world. I mean, that's a mental issue. That's not That's not a natural way of relating as human beings, but it's something that's encouraged in Western philosophical thought of having this power.
Mm.
And it goes back to your comment earlier about that this was going to happen. I don't remember your exact words, but you know, if we have, you know, if we can do it, we're going to do it. If it's possible, we're going to do it. You know, that's crazy because we can do lots of things, and that
Yeah.
doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, kind of building upon that previous question and what we just discussed, and I think I might know where you're going to go with this next one, but there are also technologists out there who are building programs where people can record their voices. They can upload videos of themselves into an AI application that then in turn will create a shadow avatar of this person. And those developing the technology, there's a fellow at MIT, I can't remember his name, but he says that, you know, this is like in lieu of photos or videos. And it's better because the avatar can be passed down to future generations. And what's more, they can interact with it. They can ask the avatar questions and it'll answer them. And it will allow them to, he says, get to know what their ancestor was like. Is this at odds with indigenous core cultural values?
You know, that's a tough one. First of all, I'd like to say that, you know, you can hand down photos and videos too. Um, but, you know, there's a good side of that, and that is that we do need to have recording of people who are knowledge holders and people who um, traditionalists who have something to say about how the world works from the perspective of that tribe's worldview. We need to have that. Now, whether we need AI and an avatar to do that is really more of the question. And of course, every one of the things that is technologically created has both good, its good side, which is what everybody promotes, and then it has these unintended consequences that generally wreak havoc on some level or another. And we don't know what that would be in such a case. When nobody ever knows what it would be. And when you start having these unintended consequences, you know, I don't see that as necessarily. I see the issue of, and I'm having a hard time here thinking about this because I don't know the value of having an interactive uh, idea or interactive interaction with an avatar. So I create an avatar of myself, and my grandkids 3 generations down see it and they get to have a discussion with me. That's in some way really interesting, but it reminds me of something that is an old computer term, came out back when computers were first starting to be developed, and people realize that the computer is just a machine. It's just sitting there, and it can't do anything unless you put in a program that's going to make the computer do something. And how that program is designed and built is the quality of your experience with the computer. And the term they came up with is garbage in, garbage out. And I use that comment when talking about AI because AI isn't well trained on issues for people of color or other marginalized communities. It's not certainly not trained in a lot of tribal stuff. So what is going to be the basis for programming this avatar? And then how do we protect information that is often for tribal members only? if it ends up getting into that avatar and other people get access to the avatar. See, I don't see the need for it. And we do have a need for recording our elders and philosophers and lawyers, healers, and everything else. We need to record these people. We need to record the stories for the future. But you don't have to add that AI stuff to make it valuable. So I don't see it as so much against the core values of a community, but I just see it as one of those things where people are playing around with technology, trying to do whatever, trying to find out what they can make with it, and um, end up creating something that is being sold as this wonderful thing, but every one of those wonderful things has a flip side to it, and we wouldn't know what that is for a generation or two.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I've got one last question for you.
Okay.
You've written that tribal colleges and universities are unique institutions where indigenous core cultural values flourish. They're, they are also often tribal communities, technology hubs.
Hmm.
So, what role do you see TCUs playing as we lean into this brave new digital age?
Oh man, you come up with some great questions here, Brad. I think that being that uh, being that technology is really, really important, it's only going to grow in importance. I think that we've got to have some discussions, and it has to happen nationally and it has to happen locally about what's our intentional use of technology. Um, and it's everything. It's not just AI, but there's all kinds of levels of technology that uh, and some of it is very, very helpful, and some of it is a whole lot of steps you go through for very little outcome. And I think that it's really important that there be some discussion, particularly of AI, at the local level, and it can't be, I was in a faculty council a couple of years ago, was trying to figure out what the AI policy was going to be, and it became this knee-jerk thing about being for or against students using chat GPT and stuff like that as research, has helped them in their research, or in some cases even write their papers. There's obviously issues with that, but I think it goes further than that. What is the policy of the institution? And at this point, we don't really have a whole lot of discussion other than people who don't know very much about it talking about it and trying to make policy about it without including very many people. And I think that having a discussion that really in depth looks at uh, the role of AI in that tribal community, in that tribal college, needs to be undertaken. And that may be something that people, some people who have the time and energy to chase down the money necessary to begin to initiate these discussions at the TCUs on a national, and not a big convening and bringing all the TCU people in, but have these discussions locally and provide resources to prepare people to think about um, AI, and then have people who come in and lead a discussion, not tell people what's going on, but actually lead a discussion of what the people think in that community about the role of AI in their world. Um, we have too much reliance on people coming in who generally the people who come in are very, very supportive of AI and not very critical in terms of its application. Um, but you need to hear from everybody. You need to hear from people who are against it and people who are for it, why they're against it, why they're for it, what is there about the technology. Those kinds of discussions have to happen at every tribal college. And and that, like you said, as tribal colleges, as the technological hub of most tribal communities, then that would also include the community and its leadership to be part of those discussions as well. One of the things that, and I don't know if it's a United States value or if it's a value of capitalism, but there's this tendency to run off and do things without really taking time to analyze what it's all about. You get in and you start doing something, and then later you find out that there's a downside to it. And I guess for me, you can tell I'm not a big fan of IA or AI. I'm not a big fan of that dehumanizing approach to problem solving, to research, to policy development, all of those things that people want to use generative AI for. I'm not a big fan of it because the human element gets lost. And we don't, how much of our humanity do we want to, turn over to, and it's not, we don't turn it over to the machine, but what we do is we withhold our own humanity and do what the machine wants. And I don't know that that's really a good way to live. I tend to look at some tribal prophecies, particularly for the Anishinaabe. Depending on who you're from, where you're from, and who you're talking to, seventh fire, eighth fire prophecy that talks about this time when human beings have to choose. Do we choose between life, or do we choose between life, or do we choose death? And when we strip our humanity out of anything, we're walking towards that trail of death. And we've got to be really careful, because we're at that time where this choice between life or death is really, really very quickly coming upon us. It's just there. And we've really got to care for our humanity the way that we care for a little baby. We have to nurture our humanity because we live in a dehumanized world. We live in a world that people are alienated from each other. We live in a world where people don't know what their role in the world is. And all of those answers can be found in the interaction between nature and humanity. But we have to nurture both. And AI does not do that.
Yeah, very profound words. Well, I just want to thank you for joining us here on Current Reflections. And yeah, this was very enlightening and interesting conversation.
Thank you.
If you're interested in learning more about artificial intelligence in Indian country, visit our website at tribalcollegejournal.org. We've got lots of great new content on AI, examining both the risks and the opportunities. Regardless of your perspective, it is an issue that we cannot afford to ignore.
Current Reflections is a production of Tribal College, Journal of American Indian Higher Education. Thank you for listening.
No da trachinin sloan shin bashes chain, but ani dashe traban dashanale. I am Marvin Tom, the subscription manager for the Tribal College Journal. Today, tribal colleges and universities are uplifting Native communities, and Tribal College Journal is their voice. So don't hesitate, subscribe to the Tribal College Journal today and help support American Indian higher education. For just $29, you will receive our quarterly publication, plus the annual edition of TCJ Student, which features creative writing and art. It is as easy as a quick phone call or email. You can reach me at 970-764-4238 or at marvin@tribalcollegejournal.org. I look forward to hearing from you. Ahiha.